we live in extraordinary political times. I don't know about you, but I find it hard to get my head around just where we are right now, because the Conservative Party seems to be in the wilderness, and reform seems to be this juggernaut that's unstoppable. It just continues to gather momentum and support, and of course the Labour Party are in chaos. So I wonder if we could start by you giving me your take on how we've got into this kind of extraordinary situation.
Mm. Right. Well, how long have you got, and how far back do you want to go? I think we can make a very simple. Let's begin by making a very simple statement first, and then trying to analyze why and how in greater detail afterwards. Essentially, if you look at Britain from the fall of the Brown government in 2010 to the Conservative Party's shattering defeat last year in July 2024, if you were an outside observer and you looked at Britain, you looked at its levels of taxation, its indebtedness, the kind of policies pursued with reference to net zero, the enforcement of hate speech laws, and so on and so on, you would actually assume that from 2010 to 2024, we had had a fairly left-wing government. Mm-hmm. In other words, whereas in the ordinary course of a two-party system, you might have accepted that after 13 years of Labour rule, new Labour rule, whatever we want to call it, from 1997 to 2010, when Cameron, admittedly in coalition with the Lib Dems, came in, there would have been significant changes of policy. In fact, there were none. There were absolutely none. And in some ways, David, this is very embarrassing because, this is the popular view. You and I are a lot online, all the popular chatter about the Uni-Party. And I'm afraid it's true. I mean, it's really very tiresome, when a sophisticate like me can't do anything better than popular opinion. So what extraordinarily happened was that effectively, the government of David Cameron, and his successors, although it wore a different political label, was broadly the same. And in one sense, this shouldn't arouse surprise, because in 2005, and we're actually celebrating, if that's the right word, the 20th anniversary of Cameron's becoming leader of the Conservative Party, he said two things. He said explicitly, I am the heir to Blair, and I want to make a Conservative Party where liberals feel welcome. So what's happened is effectively that we've had a long period of political cross-dressing. In that wonderful phrase of the 19th century about the Tories then stealing the Whigs' clothes, well, Cameron stole the Labour Party's clothes. Now, that, of course, the first time that's used is Disraeli in 1867, with the extraordinary success from the Conservatives' point of view of giving the vote to the working man. My ancestors, by the way, my father was a tool maker as well. As I've always said, he did a much better job. He did a much better job. But there we are. But the problem is, this time round, we can see that government has actually broken down. That, in other words, what we can now see, because we've got an experiment, David. I'm a great believer. My best subjects when I was a schoolboy up to O level were actually the natural sciences. They were physics and chemistry. The only reason I didn't become a scientist was that I wasn't a natural mathematician. Unfortunately, there were boys in my class who were. But I'm a passionate believer in evidence. And what we've got with the extraordinary situation that we're in now, which is why you're expressing that surprise to begin with, we have the unique spectacle of a government that has won one of the largest majorities in English history, barely 18 months old, with a prime minister about to be defenestrated, a party that not simply is incapable of governing the country, but can't actually manage itself. Now, this suggests something very, very fundamental has gone wrong. So this is where we shift gear now from the standard observation that there's been a uniparty in control to asking what actually has gone wrong. And very simply put, I think what we need to understand is that although at the time, I mean, I remember back in 1997, I remember attending an election night party at the house of actually a thoroughly unpleasant person, and I'm very happy I'm thoroughly happy to how can I say, blackguard his memory in retrospect. And I spent most of the evening with my head down the lavatory, vomiting on excessive quantities of champagne, because I had a premonition something was going to go wrong. But what I didn't realize, and this is important to say this, I did not come up with a proper analysis of the failure of the Blair and the Cameron and the all the rest of it years until years and years later. There is this wonderful saying, I mean, needless to say, it's by a great German, and because it's a great German, it's very pompous. And Hegel's remark that the owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. You can only understand history retrospectively. And it was only in retrospect that it became clear to me what Blair had actually done. If you remember at the time, I don't know about you, we all laughed when this silly little man with his preposterous hairdo and his flouncing around. There was always a faintly camp quality about Blair, despite his wife boasting about his potency. There was something. Anyway, the absurd business of we're a new country, cool Britannia, for the oldest surviving political system. I think actually in the world. Now, but you know what? He did make us a new country. He did impose a kind, I call it in retrospect again, and with the clarity of retrospect, I call it a slow burn French Revolution. He carried out the same kind of arbitrary changes to this ancient constitution, which had always worked so well, which was a model for the world, which gives the name of Parliament, this odd little Anglo-Norman institution, becomes universal. We were famously well-governed, orderly society, and so on. Blair decides he doesn't like it. And I think we need to understand there's a single key. Blair, with all his populism, with all his glottal stops, with all his pretending, fetters and Oxford though he was, to be an ordinary man, there was a bit of South London in the voice. He profoundly distrusted popular opinion. He was contemptuous of it. In other words, he was a high-flying international liberal, and he completely deliberately takes power away from Parliament because Parliament answers, however inadequately, however infrequently, to the popular vote. And what he did, he sends it in two radically different directions. He sends it to expert committees, we call them quangos, the quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations, the most important of them being the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee that sets interest rates, rates. Then there's English nature, which determines land usage, and extraordinary things like saying bats on the HS2 must have a bat tunnel at the cost of 100 million pounds, for which, as I point out, you could build them a bat Ritz and give each one of them a bat butler, to look after them. And a fish disco, even more absurd numbers of hundreds of millions of pounds, to stop fish overheating with a nuclear reaction. This absurdity, and you've got to remind you, we've got 444 of these things that control expenditure of about 500 billion pounds a year, which is 1/3 of government expenditure. In fact, it's rather more at the moment, although it's rising rapidly. At the moment, it's 1.3 trillion. So it's over 1/3 of government expenditure, and you don't control a penny. And the problem is, if you think about it, on the one hand, again, this business of language, the left has been very good at capturing language. If you think about an expert committee, doesn't it sound a good idea? You know, of course, experts should be in charge of things, but we had, again, this business of evidence. We had evidence because we were actually run by an expert committee during COVID. You know, the science committee, SAGE. And it even sounds, remember, the person who advocates government by experts is the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. And it even sounds like Plato's philosopher kings. But, you know, it was catastrophic because an expert committee has got one concern, what the experts are interested in. So the only thing the COVID committee, the only thing that SAGE cared about was as few people as possible should die of COVID. Fine. But in order to do that, you shut down the whole of the NHS apart from COVID. You turn that into a national COVID service. So it doesn't matter, bizarrely, if people die of cancer or heart disease or anything else. And it doesn't matter either, because you decide arbitrarily you're going to imitate continental Europe in imposing lockdowns. It doesn't matter. You destroy the educational opportunities of 3 generations of school children. It doesn't matter that because of furlough, you deprive people of the habit of working because you give them money for nothing. And then finally, it doesn't matter if you nearly bankrupt the country by incurring a cost 300-400 billion. 300-400 billion. It's the cost of a moderate war. And that's the problem. And it's a wonderful phrase. The authorship of it is in dispute between Teddy Roosevelt, the American populist president of the beginning of the 20th century, and Winston Churchill. You want one or both of them, perhaps, say you want your scientists, your experts on tap, but not on top. And Blair is terrible error. And then another thing that he did, which I think is even more dangerous, he completely altered the relationship between Parliament and the law. The relationship between the sovereignty of Parliament, which is the sovereignty of the British people. It's the ability of the British people to decide their own future. And Blair did not like that idea. And instead, you alter the relationship between the sovereignty of Parliament and the other principle of the so-called rule of law. And what you do is you turn the rule of law from being the proper thing, that's to say, proper process, into the rule of lawyers, as shown most dramatically by the creation of the Supreme Court and the extraordinary action of the Supreme Court in ruling Boris Johnson's prorogation of Parliament illegal. David, it's inconceivable. It flies in the face of 300 years and more of constitutional history. And I'm afraid, and if you add to that the even more dangerous idea, and this is something we should probably talk about more fully, human rights. Now, again, human rights sound lovely. But if you believe there's a thing called European human rights or universal human rights. It means actually that there is a universal human being, that in fact there is no difference. And if you actually look, by the way, at the Green Party's policies on immigration, this is what they say. There's no difference between the immigrant and the native. There's no difference between the asylum seeker and the citizen. And in fact, frontiers shouldn't really exist. There shouldn't really be states. We should all be one big happy global family in which, like the lion, like the lion and the lamb lie down happily together, and the lion nuzzles the lamb,
No.
but never even teasingly nibbles it. And we all know this is rubbish.